Let's turn to the Word of God, the book of Acts chapter 27, one of the most exciting sea stories that's ever been written. Acts chapter 27. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they handed Paul and some other prisoners over to Julius, an officer in the Roman army regiment called the Emperor's Regiment. We went aboard a ship from Adramyttium, which was ready to leave for the seaports of the province of Asia, and sailed away. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we arrived at Sidon. Julius was kind to Paul and allowed him to go and see his friends to be given what he needed. We went on from there, and because the winds were blowing against us, we sailed on the sheltered side of the island of Cyprus. We crossed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia and came to Myra in Lycia. There the officer found a ship from Alexandria that was going to sail for Italy, so he put us aboard. We sailed slowly for several days and with great difficulty finally arrived off the town of Cnidus. The wind would not let us go any further in that direction, so we sailed down the sheltered side of the island of Crete, passing by Cape Salmone. We kept close to the coast and with great difficulty came to a place called Safe Harbors, not far from the town of Lasea. We spent a long time there until it became dangerous to continue the voyage, because by now the Day of Atonement was already past. So Paul gave them this advice: "Men, I see that our voyage from here on will be dangerous. There will be great damage to the cargo and to the ship, and loss of life as well." But the army officer was convinced by what the captain and the owner of the ship said, and not by what Paul said. The harbor was not a good one to spend the winter in, so most of the men were in favor of putting out to sea and trying to reach Phoenix if possible. It is a harbor in Crete that faces southwest and northwest, and they could spend the winter there. A soft wind from the south began to blow, and the men thought that they could carry out their plan. So they pulled up the anchor and sailed as close as possible along the coast of Crete. But soon a very strong wind, the one called northeaster, blew down from the island. It hit the ship, and since it was impossible to keep the ship headed into the wind, we gave up trying and let it be carried along by the wind. We got some shelter when we passed to the south of the little island of Corda, and there with some difficulty we managed to make the ship's boat secure. They pulled it aboard and then fastened some ropes tight round the ship. They were afraid that they might run into the sandbanks off the coast of Libya, so they lowered the sail and let the ship be carried by the wind. The violent storm continued, so on the next day they began to throw the ship's cargo overboard, and on the following day they threw the ship's equipment overboard with their own hands. For many days we could not see the sun or the stars, and the wind kept on blowing very hard. We finally gave up all hope of being saved. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood before them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete. Then we would have avoided all this damage and loss. But now I beg you, take courage. Not one of you will lose his life, only the ship will be lost. For last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship came to me and said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor, and God in his goodness has given you the lives of all those who are sailing with you. And so, men, take courage, for I trust in God that it will be just as I was told, but we will be driven ashore on some island.' It was the 14th night, and we were being driven by the storm on the Mediterranean. About midnight, the sailors suspected that we were getting close to land. So they dropped a line with a weight tied to it and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A little later they did the same, found that it was 90 feet deep. They were afraid that our ship would go on the rocks, and so they lowered 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. The sailors tried to escape from the ship. They lowered the boat into the water and pretended that they were going to put out some anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the army officer and soldiers, "If these sailors don't stay on board, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the boat and let it go. Day was about to come, and Paul begged them all to eat some food. "You've been waiting for 14 days now, and all this time you have not eaten a thing. I beg you then, eat some food. You need it in order to survive. Not even a hair of your heads will be lost." After saying this, Paul took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, broke it, and began to eat. They took courage, and every one of them also ate some food. There was a total of 276 of us on board. After everyone had eaten enough, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. When day came, the sailors did not recognize the coast, but they noticed a bay with a beach and decided that if possible they would run the ship aground there. So they cut off the anchors and let them sink in the sea. And at the same time they untied the ropes that held the steering oars. Then they raised the sail at the front of the ship so that the wind would blow the ship forward, and headed for shore. But the ship hit a sandbank and went aground. The front part of the ship got stuck and could not move, while the back part was being broken to pieces by the violence of the waves. The soldiers made a plan to kill all the prisoners so that none of them would swim ashore and escape. But the army officer wanted to save Paul, so he stopped them from doing this. Instead, he ordered all the men who could swim to jump overboard first and swim ashore. The rest were to follow, holding on to the planks or to some broken pieces of the ship. And this was how we all got safely ashore. When we were safely ashore, we learned that the island was called Malta. The natives there were very friendly to us. It had started to rain and was cold, so they built a fire and made us welcome. Paul gathered up a bundle of sticks and was putting them on the fire when a snake came out on account of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. The natives saw the snake hanging on Paul's hand and said to one another, "This man must be a murderer." But fate will not let him live, even though he escaped from the sea. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire without being harmed at all. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after waiting for a long time and not seeing anything unusual happening to him, they changed their minds and said, "He is a god." Not far from that place were some fields that belonged to Publius, the chief of the island. He welcomed us kindly, and for 3 days we were his guests. Publius' father was in bed, sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul went into his room, prayed, placed his hands on him, and healed him. When this happened, all the other sick people on the island came and were healed. They gave us many gifts, and when we sailed, they put on board what we needed for the voyage. Quite a story. How do we know the Bible is true? I'm very often asked this question, especially by people who don't want it to be true. But it's a question we've got to face and answer. Like every other ancient event, you cannot prove it scientifically. The proof that we need and must have for events that took place hundreds of years ago is twofold. First of all, we must have a reliable record of what happened. And that record must have been passed down to us intact so that it hasn't been altered or embellished over the centuries. And the second thing we need to be sure of is that the person who first wrote down the record was in a position to know what happened and indeed was an honest and reliable person. Now take the events of Acts 27. How do we know that those happened? Well, first of all, do we have a reliable copy today of what was originally written? I'm thankful that this question is now settled. We have so many copies of the ancient documents of the New Testament that those whose business it is to study such things assure us, and I believe them for I've studied a bit of this myself, that we can be 98% sure that what we have written in the New Testament is what was originally written. In the few verses, the 2% of which we're not sure, no matter of Christian belief or behavior is at stake. Which means that the record has come down to us over 2,000 years, 98% accurate. That's good enough for me. I'm prepared to leave the 2% with the Lord until He gives us more copies and settles that one. But that takes us back only to the original record that was written. How do we know that that's true? Well, the answer lies in this. It is to check everything you can check in the record. And if everything that can be checked proves to be accurate, that gives you tremendous confidence that the man was writing the truth. You can't check it all, but at least you can check many of the facts. Now, in this chapter 27, there are 3 areas of facts that we can check today. First of all, geographical. There are a number of descriptions of islands and ports and places and quicksands and harbors. And the fascinating thing is that you can take Acts 27 and a modern map of the Eastern Mediterranean, and you can check every detail. You can actually chart the voyage in every particular. So accurate is the account that they have been able to identify the very bay on Malta, which is now called St. Paul's Bay, where they swam ashore. And they did it by the sandbar described in Acts 27 at the mouth of the bay. And now at St. Paul's Bay in Malta, on one of the 2 islands at the mouth of the bay, there stands a big statue of St. Paul. So that geographically, every detail in Acts 27 will stand up to checking. Now, a second area of fact that we can check is nautical fact. This is a wonderful sea story. And if you're a sailor or interested in ships, you'll find some fascinating details slipped into this account. But are they true? Do they fit? For example, were there ships then that could hold 276 people? How were they steered? How were they navigated? What was done in a storm? Now, we've got many records of sailing on the Mediterranean. The great pioneers of sailing were the Phoenicians, who lived at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. They were the first to navigate by the stars, and without compasses, without sextants. They were able to sail all the way to Cornwall in England to get tin and go back and find their way back to the eastern end of the Mediterranean. We know from other records and drawings what the ships were like. And we know, for example, that the great grain ships that went from Alexandria in Egypt back to Rome, taking from the granary of the empire, the Nile Delta, grain to feed the population of Rome. We know that these ships were 130 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet in draft, that they could hold up to 500 people. We know, too, that they were not steered with a rudder, but by 2 oars, either side of the hull. And you know, Luke mentions those in Acts 27. He gives us a perfect description of what they did when they found themselves in a storm and how they coped with it. Even to the description of a dinghy being towed along behind. And you can see that if you go to the British Museum and look at some of the ancient carvings of sea scenes. So we can check the nautical facts. And I tell you now that every detail that St. Luke records in Acts 27 is absolutely accurate to the nautical knowledge we have of that day. But there's something even more interesting, and that is the meteorological facts he records. My brother-in-law is a meteorologist with the air ministry. He'll tell you when it's going to rain and for how long. And when we ring him up, he usually says to us, well, we've just opened a box of rain and we'll have to finish it now. And that's what we get from him. But the meteorology of this chapter is fascinating. Luke gives a very careful description of the time of year. He gives us the exact date, October the 5th. He tells us what the prevailing winds were. He tells us how the ship drifted at 1.5 miles an hour for 14 days and where it landed up. And the amazing thing is that if you take a yacht into the Eastern Mediterranean today, you can use Acts 27 to tell you what the winds are going to be at that time of year and where they're going to be going. It is a perfect description and can be used by a sailor today to make the same voyage if he wishes to risk his life. And the description of the northeasters and the westerlies and the soft south wind, all these things happen to this very day. Now, in the light of the fact that geographical details are absolutely correct, that the nautical details are accurate, that the meteorological details are so good that you could use them to navigate a ship there today, I'm prepared to accept the rest on trust. I'm prepared to go along with Abraham Lincoln, who said, accept as much of the Bible as you can on the basis of reason, take the rest on faith, and you'll live and die a happier man. Chapter after chapter to the Bible is opening up to this kind of examination. If God is truth, then he doesn't mind us submitting the Bible to checking, because it will hold up under such examination. Everything that can be checked by archaeology, by meteorology, by geography, you study the books. Read Dr. Adolf Keller's book, The Bible as History, and see just how much has been checked by archaeologists. You can't prove that the events took place, but the reliability of the record stands. And if a man says, I can't believe this, it's full of myth and legend, then he can only say it by refusing to face the facts and to be open-minded. Now let's approach the truth of this chapter, because it isn't written to give us a geography lesson. It isn't written to teach us how to sail a ship in a storm. And it isn't written so that we might study the weather and give us Englishmen something more to talk about. It's given as part of the Word of God. And therefore the primary truth is personal. It's truth about men, it's truth about God, it's truth about men of God. And these are the three truths that we want to get out of this chapter. What does this tell us about human beings? It tells us a lot, because under the stress and strain of danger, human beings reveal their real feelings and attitudes. In this kind of circumstance, human nature is laid bare, and you see what stuff we are made of: superstition, panic, obstinacy. In this story, we see what God is made of, because when men cry to God, and when men are in touch with God in a crisis, then God reveals himself as he is. And we shall see some lovely things about God. But I think the focus of this chapter is in a man of God. And what happens to a man of God in a crisis? We shall see what happens to men, and it's not very pretty. We shall see what happens to God, what he is revealed as doing and being, and that's marvelous. But the main focus of the chapter is what happens to an ordinary man who becomes a man of God and who is in a crisis like this. And his attitude and his bearing in this situation is just so different from all the others. So let's approach this chapter from that point of view. I've divided it really into 4 chapters. It's a saga of the sea. And so I've really divided it into 4 chapters, and those are on the bulletin. Chapter 1, sailing. Chapter 2, storm-tossed. Chapter 3, shipwrecked. Chapter 4, safe. And at each of these points, I'm going to draw a contrast between men and the man of God. And then at the end of the study, we're going to look at God, just as God. Now, Paul is in custody. He's appealed to the emperor. He's got to be shipped to Rome under guard, and he's put in the care of a very fine officer who belongs to the King's Own Light Infantry, or the Emperor's Own Regiment, as it was called in those days. It is his job to take prisoners from the far corners of the empire back to Rome for trial before the emperor. And if a prisoner escapes, he, the soldier on guard, will have to stand in for the prisoner and will be punished with the exact punishment that was due to the prisoner. Responsible job. And a very kindly and considerate man he is, who immediately respects Paul for what he is and gives him considerable liberty. In the ports they call at, he allows Paul to go and see his friends. The first stage of the journey is very ordinary. They get a coastal vessel from Caesarea that goes up to Sidon. It manages to cut across on the leeward side of Cyprus because the easterly winds are blowing at this time. And he manages to make the coast of Asia, what is now Turkey, and then creep along the coast. And then he reaches a large harbor, and from the little coastal vessel he transfers his prisoners to a very large grain ship full of wheat from the Nile Delta, trying to make Rome before the winter sets in. Between mid-September and mid-November, sailing in the eastern Mediterranean is very difficult indeed. After November the 10th, it's impossible. And we're told that they reached this main harbor by October the 5th. Right in the middle of the dangerous period when the wind is veering round, but steadily becoming more and more that dreaded nor'easter, which prevails through the winter in the eastern Mediterranean and is blowing just the wrong way to get from Egypt through to Rome. Now it is at this point on the grain ship that the crisis occurs. They hold a council, and since Paul is an experienced sailor, he's been shipwrecked 3 times, and that qualifies you to be called in on a council, and he's been adrift in the open sea for a whole night and a day. He knows what it's like to be at sea. They call him in and they hold a council. Should we go? And you notice that Paul says no. He is not speaking by revelation, but by experience and intuition. It's a human message. Everything in him says, no, don't go. If you go, you'll lose the ship, you'll lose the cargo, you'll lose life. Don't go. And everything in Paul cried out against this voyage, and he shared his concern with the owner, the captain, and the officer in charge of the ship. Why did they not take any notice of him? He knew what he was talking about. Well, I suppose they could have said, you're not a member of the crew. But there was one very profound reason why they ignored Paul, and it was this: money. Money. It is a sad fact that men, once they've got their hands on potential profit, find it very reluctant to let that go. And here were men who valued the cargo more than the crew. Here were men who knew that if they didn't get this cargo to Rome, a lot of it could go bad, it could get wet and rot, they could lose the whole lot. And so the captain was influenced by the owner of the ship. And I'm afraid money was at the root of it. And here you've got a situation in which caution is opposed to vested interests, in which human safety is in one scale, and in the other pan of the scale is profit. And they decided to go. The tragedy is that shipping and sailing over the oceans of the world has been bedeviled and cursed by this kind of clash. One of the great Christians in England was a man called Samuel Plimsoll. Samuel Plimsoll. And you know, that man was so real a Christian that he wasn't one of these who are so heavenly minded they're of no earthly use. He really looked at people and their needs. And Samuel Plimsoll saw that most of the ships sailing from England and to our shores were overloaded because the owners wanted to make profit and the sailors risked their lives. So what did he do? He saw the ships were not safe. He saw that the decks were not safe and that the guardrails were not enough. So he invented a special shoe that could grip the deck and make life safer for the sailors. And you wear Plimsoll shoes to this day. And he got a law passed that put a line on the side of every ship that went to sea, a line that must not go under the water. The load line, the Plimsoll line. Paul had this same concern for human life. And every Christian should have it. And in these situations where people are making money and see the profit motive and have got their priorities wrong and see human life as expendable, in those situations Christians have to speak. And there are many situations in our day in which this is happening. And Paul spoke out and said, don't sail. You will lose life, not just your cargo. He was virtually saying, if you sail, you'll be murderers. But the captain listened to the owner, and the officer listened to the captain. And they said, don't listen, we sail. And they set off in the big cargo ship, and it managed to go a little way along the coast and could go no further against the wind. And so they decided to try and get round the leeward side of Crete. And they came south, round the corner of Crete. And they managed just to make a little harbor at the eastern end of Crete, Fair Havens. And there they holed up for a number of weeks. And it was a bad harbor to winter in. And the water was getting into the grain and rotting it. And they said, we must get to a safer harbor to save the grain. Again, you notice the grain, the grain, the grain. And they decided to leave Fair Havens and try and cross a big bay to the south of Crete and reach a harbor called Phoenix, where they would be sheltered for the winter. And at this point, a soft south wind began to blow, which they thought could take them northwest across the bay. I want to say a word of warning here to all of you who seek guidance, and that's all of us. And the warning is this: when we want to do a thing, we will seize the slightest favorable circumstance as proof that we ought to do it, and we may be utterly wrong. A little breeze from the south, and they thought they ought to go because it favored their plans. How often we do the same thing. We desperately want to move on for our own reasons and our own motives, and the slightest favorable circumstance we take as God's guidance. And they set off, and they were halfway across the bay when the nor'easter came. And if you trace the line of that northeaster and draw the line from Crete, the line goes straight for the Syrtis sands off the coast of Libya. They're called the Goodwin Sands of the Mediterranean. And that wind took them straight down that line for the Goodwin Sands of the Mediterranean. They're mentioned in Acts 27. You can draw all this on the map. Just draw the line down. So we come to chapter 2 of the saga, storm-tossed. And for 14 days, that great lumbering ship, which couldn't be kept head into the wind, drifted sideways on about 1.5 miles every hour, tossed around. They were so seasick they couldn't eat. And the great lumbering cargo ship wallowed in the Mediterranean. Can you see the scene? The steps they took to encounter the storm were all good sailors' routine. Number one, run before the wind in a ship that size. If you can't keep the head into the wind, let her go. Number two, get the dinghy aboard. They had to wait some days to do that. They got in the shelter of an island, passing it. They couldn't get to the island, but they managed to get the dinghy aboard. St. Luke says with difficulty, remembering his own blisters, no doubt. And they got the dinghy up on deck. And then they drifted on. Number three, to take great ropes and loop them over the bow and take them back under the ship and tie them across the top in a knot. And then take a great piece of wood and wind the rope round, tightening it. Because in a storm like that, in a big long cargo ship, it was twisting like this. And the timbers were springing open. And always the thing to do is to tie ropes round and round the ship and wind them tighter and tighter so that the timbers are held together. So they tried that. Number four, they pulled the sail down. It was just a complication now. It was causing the wind to take them in all directions, so they pulled the sail down. Number five, they threw their cargo overboard. My, what the owner felt at this point. But at least he realized now it was his life at stake, and he threw the cargo overboard. Next, number six, they took all the spare equipment, and every ship carried a duplicate of every important part of the ship, and they threw every bit of the equipment over. But no matter what men did, they could not save themselves. And they realized after 14 days, there was no hope. The ship was breaking up underneath them. Despair set in. Now, you know, that's the human reaction in a situation like this, when you've done everything you can to let despair overwhelm. What does the man of God do? He says man's extremity is God's opportunity. When man's done everything he can, that's just the point that God can step in. And it's the point at which God did step in. And Paul said his prayers on that 14th night, and God sent him a personal message. There was an angel in the boat with him, and the angel said, it's going to be all right, Paul. God wants you in Rome. You'll get there. And Paul hears some lovely news. For your sake, God is going to give you every life on this ship. What a message to have to take to them. Can you imagine? Paul couldn't resist saying, I told you so. Do you notice that he began like that? He called them all together and he said, now you should have listened to me. Now he wasn't just getting a kick out of being right when all the others were wrong. He was saying this, if only you'd listened to me, I would have given you the truth. Now listen to me now. Now you can see that I know what I'm talking about. Listen to what I've got to say. And he was saying, I told you so that they would now listen. And they did. Then he told them, it's all right. Take courage. It's all right. My God, whom I worship, will save all of you. I sometimes wonder how many people in this world have been saved from death because they've been with a Christian. That's a thought. There was a United States destroyer called the Boyd. They called it the Battling Boyd because it was in the thick of the Pacific fighting, away out in the Second World War in the Pacific Ocean. And it was terribly battered, and they had very heavy casualties and loss of life. Just looking down to get the name. One day, a young officer called Mark Levengood joined that ship. And Mark Levengood had been told by God that as soon as the war was over, he must go to be a missionary in South Africa. And I just tell you the plain fact that from the day that Mark Levengood joined that destroyer, though it remained in the thick of the fighting and the battle, from that day there was not one single casualty or loss of life on board the Battling Boyd. And Mark is now a missionary in South Africa. Make what you like of that story. But I believe there are many situations in which unbelievers, though they don't know it, have been safe because God had a servant of His near them, on board. That does not mean that the way to avoid accidents is to take a Christian with you wherever you go. I'll come back to the problems and the questions that raises, and the fact that Christians have been killed in car crashes and in airplane crashes. I'll come back to that later. But where God speaks, you are safe. I think of John Hunt again, that Lincolnshire ploughboy who went out as the first missionary to Fiji and Tonga. And after the long voyage with all its hazards, the ship arrived within sight of Fiji and was caught on the coral reef outside the bay and was wrecked, and the ship was breaking up. And John Hunt got down on his knees and he prayed to God and he said, oh God, you didn't bring me all this way to let me drown. And he prayed, and when he opened his eyes, lo and behold, bearing down on them was a gigantic tidal wave that seemed to be coming to drown them, but instead it picked up what was remaining of the ship, and it carried it 1 whole mile, and it set it down upright on the shore and retreated. And John Hunt and everybody on board climbed onto the sand. Take courage. God wanted John Hunt in Fiji. And all the coral reefs in the world can't stop God's will being done. That's chapter 2, storm-tossed. What a contrast between the men of despair and the man of God who says it's all right. Now chapter 3, shipwrecked. You getting excited in the story? What a story it is. Shipwrecked. The sailors said, we're getting near land. I don't know how they told. Maybe that's sailor's instinct. Maybe it was the color of the sea. Maybe the sound of the waves. Maybe they could hear breakers. I don't know, but they said we're getting near land. And they threw a lead and they took soundings, 120 feet, 90 feet, yes. It was dark, and they did a very wise thing. They threw out 4 sea anchors, which would go down below the shifting waves and just hold the ship slowly drifting until the dawn came. And then Paul saw panic. Panic does extraordinary things. Have you ever been in a situation when people have panicked? Have you ever seen how selfish people can get when they're panicking? Get out, get out, get out. There's only me. Only my kids. And people do awful things when they panic. That may have been happening in the Isle of Man Pleasure Centre this week. It's happened wherever there are a crowd of people and there's danger. And panic produces selfishness, concern for number one. And the sailors thought there's only one dinghy. We're near land. The ship's going to break up. Let's get the dinghy overboard. Let's get out while we can. And they lowered the dinghy pretending they were going to put an anchor at the bows, but they weren't. They were off, and Paul saw it. And Paul said, unless you stay on board this ship, we're all lost. And the soldiers cut the ropes and the dinghy floated off. Why did Paul do that? He was saying this, that where a group of people have been spoken to by God, any of those people who act as if it is not true put the whole group in jeopardy. Now, this is an important principle which I want to apply to the church. If God speaks to our fellowship and assures us of something, it would only require a few people in the fellowship to undo that word, to wreck the fellowship by not believing God and not acting together on God's word. It's a dangerous situation when a few think they know better than God. And had those sailors got into that dinghy, they were dead men. And so were their compatriots and companions on board the boat. So Paul said, if God has spoken, we hang together. If God has assured us we're all safe, then we must trust him. We must not try to save ourselves. We must act as a group. Very important principle. Now, against the panic of those men, which led to an utter concern for themselves, at the cost of leaving everybody else, this was the crew, mark you. Against that panic, there is the man of God only concerned about others. Look what he does now. He says, have a meal. You're all looking green. You've been seasick for a fortnight. Get some food into you. Isn't that practical? I love it when I read of the saints who are practical. Not always preaching and praying, but seeing a practical need and saying, now, get some food into you. And so he organized a meal in the middle of the night. He did say grace for them, and he made sure that they realized that it was the goodness of God that they were going to have that meal. But he saw that they had a meal, and he gave thanks and got them fed. And then, as an act of faith, he threw all the rest of the food overboard. You won't need another meal now. You need a meal. You're going to go into the water. You'll need energy. You'll need to keep warm. So get a breakfast. Get a meal. And then we'll throw the rest over. There they were. And then when daylight came, they saw the bay, which you can now see in Malta. Lovely little bay with a beach and a horseshoe-shaped cove with 2 islands guarding the entrance. And they were just outside it. And the sailors still believed they could save the ship. And they said, if we put the sail at the bows, the northeaster will take us straight in. And God had said the ship will be lost. Who's going to be right? They did not know that there was a sandbar which is there to this day across the mouth. And the bows stuck in it, and the stern was battered by the waves, and the ship broke up. And at that point there was the greater danger now, not from the soldiers panicking, but from the sailors panicking. Other way around, from the soldiers panicking, losing their prisoners. And so the officer at this stage came to the rescue of Paul, and he said, soldiers, if you can swim, get ashore and wait for the prisoners there, and those who can't swim will get by. And so in that dawn, with the rain and the wind and the cold, look into that bay and you see heads clinging to planks and bits of barrel and spars and anything that floats. And so they all came ashore. When God speaks, what he predicts will come true to the last letter. That's why the Bible is such a wonderful book about the future. For God has revealed so many things in the Bible about what's going to happen to our human race. And when we read those words, isn't it thrilling to know that it's going to happen to the letter, and that everything God says will happen comes true, and that when God says he'll save people and get them safely to shore, they can absolutely rely on the fact that they'll be there, and he will bring us to our desired haven. If God has said he will save you and get you to heaven, you can absolutely rely on getting there. The ship will be lost, yes, This ship we're sailing in this world, even this little craft of my body, that'll be lost, but I'll be there on shore. He's promised that. So chapter 3 comes to an end on that shore. Now let's look at chapter 4 in the saga, Safe. Verses 1 to 10. Wet and cold, wind and rain. Can you see them all huddled on the beach with their wet clothes and miserable? Safe, yes, but not yet happy. And so they build a bonfire, and the natives on the island are so friendly, and they build a bonfire for them. And here again, do you notice this? Here's Paul, the great man of God, the man who saved the whole ship, the man who's brought them through, because a man who's led by God is fit to lead others, and he's led them all to safety. And you'd have thought that Paul might have said, now then, you build a fire for me and get me warm as a reward for saving you. No. What's Paul doing? He's gathering firewood. I once read this. It's only little men who will not do little jobs. It's only little men who will not do little jobs. But Paul was a big man. He was little physically, we know that, but he was a big man spiritually. And so Paul is gathering firewood. Isn't that great? The great missionary, the man of God, the preacher, the greatest missionary perhaps there's ever been, gathering firewood. That's Christianity. It's just following Jesus. And then comes the moment where he suddenly pulls his hand back, and there's a viper with its fangs, and the viper's hanging from his hand. It's been in among the brushwood that he's been collecting. There are no poisonous snakes in Malta today. They've got rid of them all. Just as there are none in Ireland. There used to be vipers in Ireland, but there are none now. But there were snakes in the biblical days, and there it was, fastened on his hand. And now we find human superstition. Oh, how superstitious people can be. And they immediately jump to two wrong conclusions. The first, fate. Fate. Nemesis. They believe that fate must be fastening onto this man Paul, that he must be a murderer. After all, he had chains on. He must be a murderer. And he's thought he's escaped, and fate has overtaken him. How easily we interpret things as fate. But the Bible never says there is such a thing as fate or luck or chance. Hope you never use these words. Hope you don't talk about luck and about chance and about fate. No such thing. And they said fate has caught up with him. And a fatal thing has happened. And they watched this man to see if he'd swell up or die. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire. Do you know one thing Jesus said before he ascended? He said, you will take up snakes and come to no harm. That doesn't mean we've got to tempt the Lord our God as some American worshippers do. They bring rattlesnakes to church with them and hand them around the congregation. Quite sure that we'd not have such a large congregation here this morning if we do this. But I have spoken to a missionary who was bitten by a snake, a poisonous snake, and who said, God, I believe you still have more work for me to do in this place, and I claim that promise. And God kept it in that missionary's life. For there was no help or serum available, no whatever it is for him. So he claimed that promise, and God kept his word. And Paul shook the snake off. And then they said, he's a god. Human superstition. What crazy ideas superstition leads you to. They changed from thinking of Paul as a murderer at the bottom to being a god at the top. And the real truth was Paul was an ordinary man with an extraordinary God. And those hands that could shake off a snake could also ward off sickness. And Publius, the chief of the island, gave them hospitality, and they had no money. They'd thrown their cargo overboard. They had only the wet clothes they stood up in. How could they ever repay? But now I want to tell you of a principle that's terribly important. You will never get God in your debt. If you do something for a Christian, you just see what happens. Jesus said, if you give a cup of cold water to one of my disciples, you've given it to me. For a cup of cold water, read a hot water bottle. That's what was happening here. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, my brethren. That's so often misunderstood to mean whatever you do for your neighbor. Jesus said brethren. And when Jesus said brethren, he always meant his fellow Christians, his disciples, believers. And Jesus says again and again, your attitude to me is revealed by your attitude to my brethren. What you do for Christians, you do for Christ. And I will say this, if an unbeliever renders a service to a Christian, God will see that that unbeliever is in debt to God, so that the unbeliever can never say he's done something that could earn the merit before God. And so Publius, the chief, was it Publius? I forget the name. Whatever it was, who gave him the welcome, had a father sick with a very common disease in Malta, a fever and a dysentery, which is due to a microbe in the goat's milk in Malta. And this man's father was in this boat, in this condition. And Paul came and laid his hands on the man. He was healed. And soon all the sick people in the island were there. How they blessed God for that shipwreck. Do you know they left an island of healthy people? God will never let himself be in your debt. He will always keep you in his debt. And if you do anything to further the work and the witness of his people in his will, then you expect to be repaid 100-fold. That's not crude materialism. I'm just challenging you to prove God. And to help his brethren is to receive abundant blessing. So the story finishes, and they go on their way to Rome in the ship, and they go with gifts from these people, and there's goodwill and love left behind. It's a lovely finish. It's the happy ending. What does this tell us about God? It tells us first about his knowledge, that he knows every detail. Imagine it. The God who put the stars in the sky by which the ancient mariners navigated, that God knew what was happening on one tiny ship in the middle of the Mediterranean. God knows. You need never fear that God is surprised by what happens. He knows the future as well as the past. And secondly, it speaks to me of his power. God had that situation under control. One commentator says it was nothing less than a miracle that out of the whole Mediterranean they got into that bay. God's power has the situation completely under control. Therefore, may I ask finally the vital question, how do I apply Acts 27 to me? Can I claim on the grounds of this chapter that a Christian is always utterly safe from danger and disaster? That'd be wonderful if I could. It would make Christian faith the best insurance policy there is. But I can't claim that. A few years ago, I heard of two people, two great Christians. One, a friend of mine who's a minister in this country, and he was due to fly from Edinburgh to London in a Vanguard aeroplane. And in that morning, as he said his prayers, God said, go by train. So he did, even though he'd bought his air ticket. And it was that Vanguard that crashed at Heathrow a few years back. Do you remember? About the same time, I heard of Fred Mitchell of the China Inland Mission, leaving the Far East to come home and furlough, and taking off from India in the Comet aeroplane that exploded shortly after leaving the airport. It's a mystery, isn't it? Why? I do not believe that the Christian faith offers us a guarantee of safety in all danger. For too many Christians have lost their lives in danger. Is there any principle? Is there some guideline here? There is. And it's this. If you are in the center of God's will, and God has promised that he will get you somewhere, then you can claim his safety. That's the important principle. It's not a blanket insurance policy for all Christians. It's saying if I'm in the center of God's will and God has said to me, I want you there, then I can be absolutely sure he'll get me there. if I am not in a state of obedience, if I am not going to the place he has told me, then what happens? Well, look what happened to Jonah. In the same Mediterranean Ocean, on a cargo ship, and here one disobedient Christian on board the ship was bringing every sailor's life into peril. So just as one obedient Christian brings safety to the ship, so one disobedient Christian brings peril to the ship. And Jonah had to be thrown overboard and drowned before the ship could be saved. But now come with me to the Sea of Galilee. Some of us in this room this morning got up very early one morning while it was still dark and went out in a fisherman's boat into the middle of the Sea of Galilee to watch the dawn rise and worship God. The sea was like a mirror. It was so still it hardly seemed to be water. And it was there on that sea that we remembered that Jesus said, let's go to the other side. And Jesus only went places that God told him to. And Jesus said, let's go to the other side, which means absolutely certainly that the boat would reach the other side. But halfway across the storm came. And the disciples who did not have that communion with God that Jesus had got afraid and woke him up and said, we perish, we perish. And Jesus said, oh, you have little faith. If you're going where God wants you to be, you'll get there. That's what he was saying. Peace, be still. And he calmed the wind and the waves and showed that provided Jesus is with you, that's the important thing. It is sometimes his will to glorify himself by allowing a Christian to lose his life, as he did with the Auca Indians. Remember those missionaries killed in Latin America? No, it's not safety that he promises us. But he promises us this, provided we are in his will. Then he will make the decisions. And if he wants us to get to the place, he'll get us there. And if he doesn't, we'll land in heaven. So who's the loser? That's much better than the cheap human panic that says, I've got to be comfortable, I've got to be safe, I've got to be out of this. No, Paul said, take courage, God is in this. Jesus is in the boat. Let us pray. Oh God, we don't ask for comfort or even safety. We just ask that we may be in the center of your will and in the place you want us to go. And Lord, so lead us to that love of yourself that even if the worst came to the worst, it would be far better, for we would depart and be with Christ. So Lord, our lives are in your hands, and you know how long or how short you want them to be. Thank you, Lord, that we are immortal till our work is done. Amen. Let's sing the hymn on the bulletin. Master, the tempest is raging, the billows are tossing high. The sky is o'ershadowed with blackness, no shelter or help is nigh. Carest thou not that we perish? How canst thou lie asleep when each moment so madly is threatening a grave in the angry deep?